September 1923. And so you don't see Dr. Kellett at all now? Izzy asked, snapping open her enameled cigarette case and displaying a neat row of black Russian cigarettes. Gasper, she offered, holding out the case. Izzy addressed everyone as if they were the same age as herself. It was both seductive and lazy. I'm 13 years old, Ursula said. Which, as far as she could see, answered both questions. 13 is quite grown up nowadays. And life can be very short, you know, Izzy added, taking out a long ebony and ivory cigarette holder. She cast vaguely around the restaurant for a waiter to produce a light. I rather miss those little visits of yours to London. Chaperoning you to Harley Street, and then on to the Savoy for tea. A treat for both of us. I haven't seen Dr. Kellett for over a year, Ursula said. I'm considered cured. Jolly good. I, on the other hand, am considered by la famille to be incurable. You are, of course, a jeune fille bien levée, and will never know what it is like to be the scapegoat for everyone else's sins. Oh, I don't know. I think I have an idea. It was Saturday lunchtime, and they were in Simpson's. Ladies at leisure, Izzy said, over great slices of bloody beef carved off the bone before their eyes. Millie's mother, Mrs. Shawcross, was a vegetarian, and Ursula imagined her horror at the sight of the great haunch of meat. Hugh called Mrs. Shawcross, Roberta, a bohemian. Mrs. Glover called her mad. Izzy leaned towards the young waiter who had scurried over to light her cigarette. Thank you, darling, she murmured, gazing directly up into his eyes in a way that made him grow suddenly as pink as the roast beef on her plate. El iris biff, she said to Ursula, dismissing the waiter with an indifferent flap of her hand. She was always peppering her conversation with French words. I spent some time in Paris when I was younger. And of course, the war. Do you speak French? Well, we do it at school, Ursula said. But that doesn't mean I can speak it. You're a droll little thing, aren't you? Izzy inhaled deeply on her cigarette holder, and then puckered up her, astonishingly, red Cupid's bow as if she were about to play the trumpet before exhaling a stream of smoke. Several men seated nearby turned to stare at her in fascination. She winked at Ursula. I bet the first French words you learned were déjà vu. Poor old thing. Maybe you were dropped on your head as a baby. I expect I was. Come on, let's tuck in, I'm ravenous, aren't you? I'm supposed to be banting, but really there's only so much one can take, Izzy said, cutting enthusiastically into the beef. This was an improvement. When she had met Ursula on the platform at Marylebone, Izzy had looked green, and said she was a tad queasy, on account of the oysters and rum, never a good combination, after a disreputable night in a club in Jermyn Street. Now, oysters apparently forgotten, she was eating as if she were starving, even though she claimed, as usual, to be watching her figure. She also claimed to be stony broke, yet was wildly extravagant with her money. What's life worth if you can't have some fun, she said. Her life is nothing but fun as far as I can see, Hugh grumbled. Fun, and the concomitant treats, were necessary, Izzy claimed, to sweeten the fact that she had now joined the ranks of the workers, and had to pound away on a typewriter to earn her keep. Goodness, you would think she was hewing coal, Sylvie said crossly after a rare, and rather embattled family luncheon at Fox Corner. After Izzy had gone, Sylvie banged down the Worcester fruit plates she was helping Bridget to clear and said, all she's doing is producing drivel, which is something she's been doing since she first learned to talk. Heirlooms, Hugh murmured, rescuing the Worcester. Izzy had managed to get a job, God knows how, Hugh said, writing a weekly column for a newspaper, Adventures of a Modern Spinster. The column was called on the subject of being a singleton. Everyone knows that there simply aren't enough men to go round any more, she said, tearing into a bread roll at Fox Corner's Regency Revival dining table. You don't seem to have any trouble finding them, Hugh muttered. The poor boys are all dead, Izzy continued, ignoring him. Butter was plastered onto the roll with no regard for the hard labor of the cow. There's nothing can be done about it, we have to move on as best we can without them. The modern woman must fend for herself without the prospect of the succor of hearth and home. She must learn to be independent, emotionally, financially, and, most importantly, in her spirit. Rot. Hugh again. The men are not the only ones who had to sacrifice themselves in the Great War. They're dead, you're not, that's the difference. This from Sylvie. Coldly. Of course, Izzy said, mindful of Mrs. Glover at her elbow with a tureen of brown Windsor. The women of the lower classes have always known what it is to work. Mrs. Glover gave her a baleful look and tightened her grip on the soup ladle. Brown Windsor, how delicious, Mrs. Glover. What do you put in it to make it taste this way? Really? How interesting. We're moving towards a classless society, of course, a remark directed at Hugh, but which earned a snort of derision from an unappeased Mrs. Glover. Are you a Bolshevik this week then? Hugh asked. We're all Bolsheviks now, Izzy said blithely. And at my table. Hugh said and laughed. She's such a fool, Sylvie said when Izzy had finally departed for the station. And so much makeup. You would think she was on the stage. Of course, in her head she's always on the stage. She is her own theater. The hair, Hugh said regretfully. It went without saying that Izzy had bobbed her hair before anyone else they knew. Hugh had expressly forbidden the women in his family to cut their hair. Almost as soon as he had issued this paternal edict, the normally unrebellious Pamela had gone into town with Winnie Shawcross, and the pair of them had returned shingled and shorn. It's just easier for games, was Pamela's rational explanation. Pamela had saved her heavy plates, whether as relics or trophies, it was hard to say. Mutiny in the ranks, eh? Hugh said. Neither of them being the argumentative sort, that was the end of the conversation. The plates now lived at the back of Pamela's underwear drawer. You never know, they might come in useful for something, she said. No one in the family could imagine what that something might be. Sylvie's feelings about Izzy went deeper than hair or makeup. She had never forgiven Izzy for the baby. He would be 13 now, the same age as Ursula. A little Fritz or Hans, she said. My own children's blood running through his veins. But of course, the only thing of any interest to Izzy is Izzy. Still, she can't be entirely shallow, Hugh said. I expect she saw some awful things in the war. As if he hadn't. Sylvie tossed her head. There might have been a halo of gnats around her own lovely hair. She was rather envious of Izzy's war, even the awfulness. She's still a fool, she said, and Hugh laughed and said, yes, she is. Ultsy's column seemed for the most part to be nothing more than a diary of her own hectic personal life with the odd social comment thrown in. Last week it had been How High Can They Go, and was about the rise of the emancipated female hemline, but consisted mostly of Izzy's tips to acquire the necessary shapely ankles. Stand backwards on tiptoe, on the bottom step of a staircase, and let your heels drop over the edge. Pamela practiced all week on the attic staircase, and declared no improvement at all. Much against his will, Hugh felt it necessary to buy Izzy's newspaper every Friday, and read it on the train home, just to keep an eye on what she's saying, and then jettison the offending item on the hall table, from where Pamela was able to rescue it. Hugh harbored a particular horror that Izzy would write about him, and his only comfort was that she wrote under the pseudonym Delphine Fox, which was the silliest name that Sylvie had ever heard. Well, Hugh said, Delphine is her middle name, from her godmother. And Todd is an old word for fox, so I suppose there is some logic in it. Not that I'm defending her. But it's my name, it's on my birth certificate, Izzy said, looking hurt when attacked over the pre-prandial decanter. And it's from Delphi, you know, the oracle, and so on. So rather fitting, I would have said. She's an oracle now, from Sylvie. If she's an oracle, then I'm the high priestess of Tutankhamun. Izzy, in the person of Delphine, had already on more than one occasion mentioned my two nephews, terrific rascals, both of them, but had not cited any names. So far, Hugh said darkly, She had made up a few amusing anecdotes about these clearly fictional nephews. Maurice was 18, Izzy's sturdy little chaps were 9 and 11, still away at boarding school, and had spent no more than 10 minutes in Izzy's company in as many years. As for Teddy, he tended to avoid situations that might evolve into anecdotes. Who are these boys? Sylvie quizzed over Mrs. Glover's surprisingly capricious interpretation of Sol Veronique. She had the folded newspaper on the table next to her and tapped Izzy's column with her forefinger, as if it might be impregnated with germs. Are they supposed to be based in some way on Maurice and Teddy? What about Jimmy? Teddy said to Izzy. Why don't you write about him? Jimmy, perky in a sky-blue knitted jumper, was spooning mashed potato into his mouth, and didn't look too bothered about being written out of great literature. He was a child of the peace. The war to end all wars had, after all, been fought for Jimmy. Yet again, Sylvie claimed to be taken by surprise by the newest addition to the family, for it had seemed like the complete set. Once, Sylvie had had no idea how children were started, now she seemed uncertain as to how you might stop them. Jimmy's an afterthought, I suppose, Sylvie said. I wasn't thinking much, Hugh said, and they both laughed, and Sylvie said, Really, Hugh? Jimmy's arrival had the effect of making Ursula feel as if she was being pushed further away from the heart of the family, like an object at the edge of an overcrowded table. A cuckoo, she had overheard Sylvie say to Hugh. Ursula's a bit of an awkward cuckoo. But how could you be a cuckoo in your own nest? You are my real mother, aren't you? She asked Sylvie, and Sylvie laughed and said, incontrovertibly, dear. The odd one out, she said to Dr. Kellett. Well, there always has to be one, he said. Don't write about my children, Isabel, Sylvie said heatedly to Izzy. They're imaginary, for heaven's sake, Sylvie. Don't even write about my imaginary children. She lifted the tablecloth and peered at the floor. What are you doing with your feet? She said testily to Pamela, who was sitting opposite her. I'm making circles with my ankles, Pamela said, unconcerned by Sylvie's irritability. Pamela was quite bold these days, but also rather reasonable, a combination that seemed designed to annoy Sylvie. You are so like your father, she had said to Pamela only this morning over some trifling difference of opinion. But why would that be a bad thing? Pamela said. Pamela wiped gluey potato from Jimmy's pink cheeks and said, clockwise, then anti-clockwise. It's the way to a shapely ankle, according to Aunt Izzy. Izzy is not a person from whom anyone with any sense would take advice. Excuse me, Izzy said. Besides which, you're too young for shapely ankles. Well, Pamela said, I'm nearly the same age as you were when you married Daddy. Oh, splendid, Hugh said, relieved at the sight of Mrs. Glover waiting in the doorway to make a grand entrance with a riz imperatrice. The ghost of Escoffier is at your back today, Mrs. Glover. Mrs. Glover couldn't help but glance behind her. Oh, splendid, Izzy said. A cabinet pudding. You can rely on Simpson's for nursery food. We had a nursery, you know, it took up the whole top floor of the house. In Hampstead. Grandmama's house. The very same. I was the baby. Like Jimmy. Izzy wilted a little, as if she were remembering some hitherto long-forgotten sadness. The ostrich feather on her hat trembled in sympathy. She revived at the sight of the silver sauce boat of custard. And so you don't have those odd feelings anymore. The déjà vu and so on. Me? Ursula said. No. Sometimes. Not so much, I suppose. It was before, you know. Now it's gone. Sort of. Had it? She was never sure. Her memories seemed like a cascade of echoes. Could echoes cascade? Perhaps not. She had tried, and largely failed, to learn to be precise with language under Dr. Kellett's guidance. She missed that cozy hour, tête-à-tête, he called it. More French, on a Thursday afternoon. She was 10 years old when she first went to see him, and had enjoyed being liberated from Fox Corner, in the company of someone who gave his full attention to her, and only her. Sylvie, or more often than not Bridget, put Ursula on the train, and she was met at the other end by Izzy, even though both Sylvie and Hugh doubted that Izzy was sufficiently reliable to be in charge of a child. Expediency, Izzy said to Hugh, generally trumps ethics, I've noticed. Personally, if I had a 10-year-old child, I don't think I would feel entirely comfortable allowing it to travel all on its own. You do have a 10-year-old child, Hugh pointed out. The little Fritz. Couldn't we try and find him? Sylvie asked. Needle in a haystack, Hugh said. The Hun are legion. So I rather miss seeing you, Izzy said, which is why I asked if you could come up for the day. To be frank, I was surprised Sylvie agreed. There's always been a certain, shall we say, froidure between your mother and myself. I of course am considered mad, bad and dangerous to know. Anyway, I thought I should try to single you out from the herd, as it were. You remind me a little of me. Was that a good thing? Ursula wondered. We could be special chums, what do you think? Pamela's a little dull, Izzy continued. All that tennis and cycling, no wonder she has such sturdy ankles. Trey's sportive, I'm sure, but still. And science. No fun in that. And the boys are, well, boys, but you're interesting, Ursula. All that funny stuff in your head about knowing the future. Quite the little clairvoyant. Perhaps we should set you up in a gypsy caravan, get you a crystal ball, tarot cards. The drowned Phoenician sailor, and all that. You can't see anything in my future, can you? No, reincarnation, Dr. Kellett had said to her. Have you heard of that? Ursula, aged 10, shook her head. She had heard of very little. Dr. Kellett had a nice set of rooms in Harley Street. The one that he showed Ursula into was half-paneled in mellow oak, with a thick carpet figured in red and blue on the floor, and 2 large leather armchairs either side of a well-stoked coal fire. Dr. Kellett himself wore a 3-piece Harris tweed suit strung with a large gold fob watch. He smelt of cloves and pipe tobacco, and had a twinkly look about him, as if he were going to toast muffins or read a particularly good story to her, but instead he beamed at Ursula and said, So, I hear you tried to kill your maid. Oh, that's why I'm here, Ursula thought. He offered her tea, which he brewed in something called a samovar in the corner of the room. Although I'm not Russian, far from it, I'm from Maidstone. I visited St. Petersburg before the revolution. He was like Izzy in that he treated you as a grown-up, or at least he appeared to, but that was where the resemblance ended. The tea was black and bitter and only drinkable with the aid of heaps of sugar, and the contents of the tin of Huntley and Palmer's Marie biscuits that sat between them on a little table. He had trained in Vienna, where else, but trod, he said, his own path. He was no one's disciple, he said, although he had studied at the feet of all of the teachers. One must nose forward, he said. Nudge one's way through the chaos of our thoughts. Unite the divided self. Ursula had no idea what he was talking about. The maid? You pushed her down the stairs. It seemed a very direct question for someone who talked about nosing and nudging. It was an accident. She didn't think of Bridget as the maid, she thought of her as Bridget. And it was ages ago now. Your mother is worried about you. I just want you to be happy, darling, Sylvie said after she had made the appointment with Dr. Kellett. Aren't I happy? Ursula puzzled. What do you think? Ursula didn't know. She wasn't sure that she had a yardstick against which to measure happiness or unhappiness. She had obscure memories of elation, of falling into darkness, but they belonged to that world of shadows and dreams that was ever present and yet almost impossible to pin down. As if there is another world. Dr. Kellett said. Yes. But it's this one as well. I know she says the oddest things, but a psychiatrist. Hugh said to Sylvie. He frowned. She's only small. She's not defective. Of course not. She just needs a little fixing. And hey presto, you're fixed. How marvelous, Izzy said. He was an odd little bod, that mind doctor, wasn't he? Shall we essay the cheese board, the Stiltons, so ripe it looks as if it's about to walk away of its own accord, or shall we tootle off and go to mine? I'm stuffed, Ursula said. Me too. Tootle off it is then. Shall I pick up the bill? I have no money. I'm 13, Ursula reminded her. They left the restaurant and to Ursula's astonishment, Izzy sauntered a few yards up the Strand and climbed into the driver's seat of a gleaming open-top car, parked, rather carelessly, outside the coal hole. You have a car? Ursula exclaimed. Good, isn't it? Not exactly paid for. Hop in. A Sunbeam, sports model. Certainly beats driving an ambulance. Wonderful in this weather. Shall we take the scenic route, go along the embankment? Yes, please. Ah, the Thames, Izzy said when the river came into view. The nymphs, sadly, are all departed. It was a lovely late September afternoon, crisp as an apple. London's glorious, isn't it? Izzy said. She drove as if she were on the circuit at Brooklands. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ursula supposed that if Izzy had managed to drive throughout the war unscathed, then they would probably make it along the Victoria Embankment without coming to grief. As they approached Westminster Bridge, they had to slow down on account of the crowds of people whose flow had been interrupted by a largely silent demonstration of unemployed men. I fought overseas, a placard held aloft read. Another proclaimed hungry and wanting to work. They're so meek, Izzy said dismissively. There'll never be a revolution in this country. Not another one at any rate. We chopped the head off a king once and felt so guilty about it that we've been trying to make up for it ever since. A shabby-looking man came up alongside the car and shouted something incomprehensible at Izzy, although the meaning was clear. Tu ils mangent de la brioche, Izzy murmured. You know she never said that, don't you? Marie Antoinette. She's a rather maligned figure in history. You must never believe everything they say about a person. Generally speaking, most of it will be lies, half-truths at best. It was hard to figure out whether Izzy was a royalist or a Republican. Best not to adhere too closely to one side or the other really, she said. Big Ben told a solemn 3 o'clock as the sunbeam pushed its way through the throng. Si lunga tratta di gente, chio non avrei mai credito che mort tanta enavis disfatta. Have you read Dante? You should. He's very good. How did Izzy know so much? Oh, she said airily. Finishing school. And I spent some time in Italy after the war. I took a lover, of course. An impoverished count, it's more or less de rigueur when you're over there. Are you shocked? No, she was. Ursula wasn't surprised there was a froidure between her mother and Izzy. Reincarnation is at the heart of Buddhist philosophy, Dr. Kellett would say, sucking on his meerschaum pipe. All conversations with Dr. Kellett were punctuated by this object, whether by gesture, a great deal of pointing with both mouthpiece and Turk's head bowl, fascinating in itself, or the necessary ritual of emptying, filling, tamping, lighting and so on. Have you heard of Buddhism? She hadn't. How old are you? 10. Still quite new. Perhaps you're remembering another life. Of course, the disciples of the Buddha don't believe that you keep coming back as the same person in the same circumstances, as you feel you do. You move on, up or down, sideways occasionally, I expect. Nirvana is the goal. Non-being, as it were. At 10 it seemed to Ursula that perhaps being should be the goal. Most ancient religions, he continued, adhered to an idea of circularity, the snake with its tail in its mouth, and so on. I've been confirmed, she said, trying to be helpful. Church of England. Dr. Kellett had come to Sylvie recommended by Mrs. Shawcross via Major Shawcross, their next-door neighbor. Kellett had done a lot of good work, the Major said, with men who needed help. After they returned from the war, there was a suggestion that the Major himself had needed help. Ursula's path crossed occasionally with some of these other patients. Once there was a dejected young man who stared at the carpet in the waiting room speaking quietly to himself, another who tapped his foot restlessly in time to something only he could hear. Dr. Callett's receptionist, Mrs. Duckworth, who was a war widow and had been a nurse during the war, was always very nice to Ursula, offering her peppermints and asking her about her family. One day a man blundered into the waiting room, although the doorbell downstairs had never rung. He looked bewildered and a little wild, but he just stood stock still in the middle of the room, staring at Ursula as if he'd never seen a child before, until Mrs. Duckworth led him to a chair and sat down next to him, and then put her arm round him and said, Now, Billy, what is it?" the way a nice mother would have done, and Billy laid his head on her chest and began to sob. If Teddy ever cried when he was younger, Ursula could never bear it. It seemed to open up a chasm inside, something deep and dreadful and full of sorrow. All she ever wanted was to make sure he never felt like crying again. The man in Dr. Callett's waiting room had the same effect on her. "That's how motherhood feels every day," Sylvie said. Dr. Callett came out of his room at that moment and said, "Come along, Ursula. I'll see to Billy later." But when Ursula finished her appointment, Billy was no longer in the waiting room. "Poor man," Mrs. Duckworth said sadly. The war, Dr. Callett said to Ursula, had made many people search for meaning in new places: theosophy, Rosicrucianism, anthroposophy, spiritualism. Everyone needs to make sense of their loss. Dr. Callett himself had sacrificed a son, Guy, a captain in the Royal West Surreys, lost at Arras. One must hold on to the idea of sacrifice, Ursula. It can be a higher calling. He showed her a photograph, not one taken in uniform, just a snapshot really, of a boy in cricket whites, standing proudly behind his bat. "Could have played for the county," Dr. Callett said sadly. "I like to think of him, of all of them, playing a never-ending game in heaven. A perfect afternoon in June, always just before they break for tea. It seemed a shame for all the young men never to have their tea. Bosun was in heaven, along with Sam Wellington, the old boot, and Clarence Dodds, who had died with astonishing speed of the Spanish flu the day after the armistice. Ursula couldn't imagine any of them playing cricket. "Of course, I don't believe in God," Dr. Callett said. "But I believe in heaven. One has to," he added, rather bleakly. Ursula wondered how all of this was supposed to fix her. "From a more scientific point of view," he said, "perhaps the part of your brain responsible for memory has a little flaw, a neurological problem that leads you to think that you are repeating experiences. As if something had got stuck. She wasn't really dying and being reborn," he said, "she just thought she was." Ursula couldn't see what the difference was. Was she stuck? And if so, where? "But we don't want it to result in you killing the poor servants, do we?" "But it was such a long time ago," Ursula said. "It's not as if I've tried to kill anyone since." Down in the dumps, Sylvie said at their first meeting with Dr. Callett, the only time, she had been to the Harley Street rooms with Ursula, although she had clearly already talked to him without Ursula. Ursula wondered very much what had been said about her. "And she's rather forlorn all the time," Sylvie continued. "I can understand an adult feeling like that, can you?" Dr. Callett said, leaning forward, the meerschaum indicating interest. "Do you?" "I'm not the problem," Sylvie said with her most gracious smile. "I'm a problem," Ursula thought. And anyway, she hadn't been killing Bridget, she was saving her. And if she wasn't saving her, perhaps she was sacrificing her. Hadn't Dr. Callett himself said sacrifice was a higher calling? "If I were you, I would stick to traditional moral guidelines," he said. "Fate isn't in your hands. That would be a very heavy burden for a little girl." He got up from his chair and put another shovel of coal on the fire. "There are some Buddhist philosophers, a branch referred to as Zen, who say that sometimes a bad thing happens to prevent a worse thing happening," Dr. Callett said. "But of course, there are some situations where it's impossible to imagine anything worse." Ursula supposed he was thinking of Guy, lost at Arras, and then denied his tea and cucumber sandwiches for eternity. "Try this," Izzy said, squirting a perfume atomizer in Ursula's direction. Chanel number 5. It's quite the thing. She's quite the thing. Her strange, synthetic perfumes. She laughed as if she had made a great joke and sprayed another invisible cloud around the bathroom. It was quite different from the flowery scents that Sylvie anointed herself with. They had finally arrived at Izzy's flat in Basil Street, rather a dull android but handy for Harrods. Izzy's bathroom was pink and black marble. I designed it myself. Delicious, isn't it? And was all sharp lines and hard corners. Ursula hated to think what would happen if you slipped and fell in here. Everything in the flat seemed to be new and shiny. It was nothing like Fox Corner, where the slow-seeming tick of the grandfather clock in the hall counted time, and the patina of years shone on the parquet floors. The Meissen figures with their missing fingers and chipped toes, the Staffordshire dogs with accidentally lopped-off ears, bore no resemblance to the Bakelite bookends and onyx ashtrays in Izzy's rooms. In Basil Street everything looked so new it seemed to belong in a shop. Even the books were new, novels and volumes of essays and poetry by writers Ursula had never heard of. One must keep up with the times, Izzy said. Ursula regarded herself in the bathroom mirror. Izzy stood behind her, Mephistopheles to her Faustus, and said, "Goodness, you're turning out to be quite pretty," before rearranging her hair into different styles. "You must have it cut," she said. "You should come to my coiffeur. He's really very good. You're in danger of looking like a milkmaid, when really I think you're going to turn out to be deliciously wicked." Izzy danced around the bedroom singing, "I wish I could shimmy like my sister Kate." "Can you shimmy?" "Look, it's easy." It wasn't, and they collapsed in laughter on the satin eiderdown of the bed. "Gort to ave fun, aven to you," Izzy said in an atrocious mock Cockney accent. The bedroom was a terrible mess, clothes everywhere, satin petticoats, crepe de chine nightdresses, silk stockings, partnerless shoes lying abandoned on the carpet, a dusting of Coty powder over everything. "You can try things on if you want," Izzy said carelessly. "Although you're rather small compared to me." "Jolie et petite." Ursula declined, fearing enchantment. They were the kind of clothes that might turn you into someone else. "What shall we do?" Izzy said, suddenly bored. "We could play cards." "Bezique?" She danced through to the living room, and tripped her way towards a large shining chrome object that looked as if it belonged on the bridge of an ocean liner, and turned out to be a cocktail cabinet. "A drink?" She looked doubtfully at Ursula. "No, don't tell me, you're only 13. She sighed, lit a cigarette and looked at the clock. "We're too late to catch a matinee, too early for an evening performance. London Calling is on at the Duke of York's. It's supposed to be very amusing. We could go, you could get a later train home." Ursula fingered the keys on the royal typewriter that sat on a desk at the window. "My trade," Izzy said. "Perhaps I should put you in this week's column." "Really? What would you say?" "I don't know, make something up, I expect," she said. "That's what writers do." She took out a record from the cabinet of the gramophone, and put it on the turntable. "Listen to this," she said. "You've never heard anything like it." It was true, she hadn't. It started with a piano, but nothing like the Chopin and Liszt that Sylvie played so nicely, and Pamela in such a pedestrian fashion. "They call it honky-tonk, I believe," Izzy said. A woman began to sing, raw and American. She sounded as if she had spent her life in a prison cell. "Ida Cox," Izzy said. "She's a negress." "Isn't she extraordinary?" She was. "Singing about how wretched it is to be a woman," Izzy said, lighting up another cigarette and sucking hard. "If only one could find someone really filthy rich to marry. A large income is the best recipe for happiness I ever heard of." "Do you know who said that?" "No?" "Well, you should." She was suddenly irritable, a not completely domesticated animal. The phone rang and she said, "Saved by the Bell," and proceeded to have a feverishly animated conversation with the unseen, unheard caller. She ended the call by saying, "That would be delish, darling, meet you in half an hour." And to Ursula, "I would offer you a lift, but I'm going to Claridge's, and it's simply miles from Marylebone, and after that I have a party to go to in Lowndes Square, so I can't possibly see you to the station." "You can tube it to Marylebone, can't you?" "You know how. The Piccadilly line to Piccadilly Circus, and then change to the Baccaloo to Marylebone." "Come on, I'll walk out with you." When they reached the street, Izzy breathed deeply, as if she'd been released from unwanted confinement. "Ah, twilight," she said. "The violet hour. Lovely, isn't it?" She kissed Ursula on the cheek and said, "It was marvelous seeing you, we have to do this again. Are you all right from here?" "Tout droid on to Sloane Street, turn left and Bob's your uncle, there's Knightsbridge tube station." "Toodle-oo then." "Amor fati," Dr. Kellett said, "have you heard of that?" It sounded like he had said, "amor fati." Ursula was puzzled, both herself and Dr. Kellett were on the lean side. Nietzsche, a philosopher, he said, was drawn to it. A simple acceptance of what comes to us, regarding it as neither bad nor good. Verdi, der du bist, as he would have it, Dr. Kellett continued, knocking the ashes from his pipe onto the hearth from where Ursula supposed someone else would sweep them up. "Do you know what that means?" Ursula wondered how many 10-year-old girls Dr. Kellett had actually encountered before. "It means become who you are," he said, adding more shreds of tobacco to the meerschaum. The being before the non-being, Ursula supposed. Nietzsche got that from Pindar. "Do you know Greek?" He had quite lost her now. "It means, become such as you are, having learned what that is." Ursula thought he said from Pinner, which was where Hugh's old nanny had retired to, living with her sister above a shop in an old building on the high street. Hugh had driven Ursula and Teddy out there in his splendid Bentley one Sunday afternoon. Nanny Mills was rather frightening, although not to Hugh apparently, spending a lot of time quizzing Ursula about her manners and inspecting Teddy's ears for dirt. Her sister was nicer and plied them with glasses of elderflower cordial and slices of milk fudge spread with blackberry jelly. "How is Isabel?" Nanny Mills asked, her mouth set like a prune. "Izzy is Izzy," Hugh said, which if you repeated it very quickly, as Teddy did later, sounded like a small swarm of wasps. Izzy, apparently, had become herself a long time ago. It seemed unlikely that Nietzsche had obtained anything from Pinner, least of all his beliefs. "Nice time with Izzy?" Hugh asked when he picked her up from the station. There was something reassuring about the sight of Hugh in his grey Homburg and long dark blue wool overcoat. He scrutinized her for any visible change. She thought it best not to tell him that she had taken the tube on her own. It had been a terrifying adventure, a dark night in the forest, but one which, like any good heroine, she had survived. Ursula shrugged. "We went to Simpson's for lunch." Hugh said as if trying to decipher a meaning from this. "We listened to a negress singing." "In Simpson's?" Hugh puzzled. "On Izzy's gramophone." Again. He opened the car door for her and she settled into the lovely leathery seat of the Bentley, almost as reassuring as Hugh himself. Sylvie regarded the car as ruinously extravagant. It was breathtakingly expensive. The war had made Sylvie parsimonious. Slivers of soap were collected and boiled down for the laundry, sheets turned side to middle, hats refurbished. "We would live on eggs and chickens if she had her way," Hugh laughed. He, on the other hand, had become less prudent since the war, perhaps not the best trait for a banker to develop, Sylvie said. "Carpe diem," Hugh said, and Sylvie said, "You were never one for seizing." "Izzy has a car now," Ursula offered. "Does she?" Hugh said. "I'm sure it's not as splendid as this beast." He patted the dashboard of the Bentley fondly. As they drove away from the station he said quietly, "She's not to be trusted." "Who?" "Mother." "The car." "Izzy." "No, you're probably right," Ursula agreed. "How did you find her?" "Oh, you know. Incurable. Izzy is Izzy, after all." When they returned to the house, they found Teddy and Jimmy playing a tidy game of dominoes on the table in the morning room, while Pamela was next door with Gertie Shawcross. Winnie was slightly older than Pamela, and Gertie slightly younger, and Pamela divided her time equally between them, but rarely both at the same time. Ursula, devoted to Millie, found it an odd arrangement. Teddy loved all the Shawcross girls, but his heart was in Nancy's small hands. Of Sylvie there was no sign. "Don't know," Bridget said, rather indifferently, when Hugh inquired. Mrs. Glover had left them a rather utilitarian mutton stew keeping warm in the range. Mrs. Glover no longer lived with them at Fox Corner. She rented a little house in the village so that she could look after George as well as them. George hardly ever left the house. Bridget referred to him as a poor soul, and it was hard to disagree with that description. If it was good weather, or even not particularly good weather at all, he sat in a big ugly bath chair at the front door and watched the world pass him by. His handsome head, leonine, once, Sylvie said sadly, hung down on his chest, and a long thread of drool dangled from his mouth. "Poor devil," Hugh said. "Better off if he'd been killed." Sometimes one or other of them tagged along when Sylvie, or a more reluctant Bridget, visited him during the day. It seemed odd that they would go to his home to see him while his own mother stayed in their home looking after them. Sylvie would fuss with the blanket across his legs, and fetch him a glass of beer, and then wipe his mouth the way you did with Jimmy. There were other war veterans in the neighborhood, visible thanks to their limps or missing limbs. All those unclaimed arms and legs lost in the fields of Flanders, Ursula imagined them pushing roots down into the mud and shoots up to the sky, and growing once again into men. An army of men marching back for revenge. "Ursula has morbid thoughts," she heard Sylvie say to Hugh. Ursula had become a great eavesdropper. It was the only way to find out what people were really thinking. She didn't hear Hugh's answer as Bridget came crashing into the room in a fury because the cat, Hattie, one of Queenie's offspring, possessed of the same character as her mother, had stolen the poached salmon that was to have been their lunch. There were those, too, who, like the men in Dr. Callett's waiting room, had less visible injuries. There was an ex-soldier in the village called Charles Chorley who had served with the Buffs, and had come through the war without a scratch, and then one day in the spring of 1921 he had stabbed his wife and 3 children, where they lay sleeping in their beds, and then shot himself in the head with a Mauser he had taken from a German soldier he had killed at Bapaume. "Terrible mess," Dr. Fellows reported. "These chaps should think about the people who have to clean up afterwards." Bridget, of course, had her own cross to bear, having lost Clarence. Like Izzy, Bridget was resigned to spinsterhood, although she embraced it in a less giddy fashion. They had all attended Clarence's funeral, even Hugh. Mrs. Dodds had been her usual restrained self, and had flinched when Sylvie placed a comforting hand on her arm, but after they had shuffled away from the gaping hole of the grave, "Not a thing of beauty, not at all," Mrs. Dodds said to Ursula, "part of him died during the war. This was just the rest of him catching up," and she put her finger to the corner of her eye and dabbed at a trace of moisture there. A tear would have been too generous a description. Ursula didn't know why she had been chosen for this confidence, possibly simply because she was the nearest person. Certainly no response was expected or received. Ironic, one might say, Sylvie said, for Clarence to have survived the war and to die of an illness. "What would I have done if one of you had caught the influenza?" she often said. Ursula and Pamela had spent a considerable amount of time discussing whether Clarence had been buried with his mask on or off. And if off, where might it be now? They didn't feel it was the kind of thing that they could ask Bridget. Bridget said bitterly that old Mrs. Dodds had finally got her son to herself, and stopped another woman taking him away from her. A little harsh, perhaps, Hugh murmured. Clarence's photograph, a print of the one taken for his mother, before Bridget knew him, before he marched off to his destiny, had now joined that of Sam Wellington in the shed. "The endless ranks of the dead," Sylvie said angrily. "Everyone wants to forget them." "Well, I certainly do," Hugh said. Sylvie returned in time for Mrs. Glover's apple charlotte. Their own apples, a small orchard that Sylvie had planted at the end of the war, was beginning to bear fruit. When Hugh wondered where she had been, she said something indistinct about Gerard's Cross. She sat at the dining table and said, "I'm not really terribly hungry." Hugh caught her eye and, nodding in Ursula's direction, said, "Izzy." An exquisite shorthand communication. Ursula had expected an inquisition, but all Sylvie said was, "Good Lord, I had quite forgotten that you had been to London. You've returned in one piece, I'm glad to see." "Untainted," Ursula said brightly. "Do you, by the way, know who it was who said, 'A large income is the best recipe for happiness I ever heard of'?" Sylvie's knowledge, like Izzy's, was random yet far-ranging, the sign that one has acquired one's learning from novels, rather than an education, according to Sylvie. "Austin," Sylvie said promptly. "Mansfield Park." She puts the words in Mary Crawford's mouth, for whom she professes disdain, of course, but really I expect dear, and Jane rather believed those words. "Why?" Ursula shrugged. "Nothing. Till I came to Mansfield, I had not imagined a country parson ever aspired to a shrubbery, or anything of the kind. Wonderful stuff. I always think the word shrubbery denotes a certain kind of person." "We have a shrubbery," Hugh said, but Sylvie ignored him and continued to Ursula, "You really should read Jane Austen. You're surely the right age by now." Sylvie seemed quite gay, a mood somehow at odds with the mutton that was still sitting on the table in its dull brown pot, little ponds of white fat congealing on the surface. "Really," Sylvie said sharply, turning suddenly like the weather. "Standards are falling everywhere, even in one's own home." Hugh raised his eyebrows, and before Sylvie had a chance to call on Bridget, he got up from the table and took the stewpot back to the kitchen himself. Their little maid of all work, Marjorie, no longer so little, had recently decamped, and Bridget and Mrs. Glover were left to shoulder the burden of looking after them. "It's not as if we're demanding in any way," Sylvie said crossly when Bridget mentioned that she hadn't had a pay rise since the end of the war. She should be grateful. In bed that night, Ursula and Pamela still shared the cramped quarters of the attic bedroom, like prisoners in a cell according to Teddy. Pamela said, "Why didn't she invite me as well as you, or even instead of you?" This, being Pamela, was said with genuine curiosity rather than malice. "She thinks I'm interesting." Pamela laughed and said, "She thinks Mrs. Glover's brown Windsor is interesting." "I know. I'm not flattered." "It's because you're pretty and clever," Pamela said, "while I am merely clever." "That's not true, and you know it," Ursula said, hotly defensive of Pamela. "I don't mind. She says she'll put me in her newspaper next week, but I don't suppose she will." Ursula, in her account to Pamela of the day's adventures in London, had omitted a scene she had witnessed, unseen by Izzy, who had been preoccupied with turning the car round in the middle of the road outside the coal hole. A woman wearing a mink coat had come out of the entrance to the Savoy, on the arm of a rather elegant man. The woman was laughing in a carefree way at something the man had just said, but then she broke away from his arm to search in her handbag for her purse in order to drop a handful of coins into the bowl of an ex-soldier who was sitting on the pavement. The man had no legs and was perched on some kind of makeshift wooden trolley. Ursula had seen another limbless man on a similar contraption outside Marylebone Station. Indeed, the more she had looked on the London streets, the more amputees she had seen. A doorman from the hotel darted out of Savoy Court and advanced on the legless man, who quickly scooted away using his hands as oars on the pavement. The woman who had given him money remonstrated with the doorman. Ursula could make out her handsome, impatient features, but then the elegant man took her gently by the elbow and guided her away up the Strand. The remarkable thing about this scene was not the content but the characters. Ursula had never seen the elegant man before, but the agitated woman was quite unmistakably Sylvie. If she hadn't recognized Sylvie, she would have recognized the mink, given to her by Hugh for their 10th wedding anniversary. She seemed a long way from Gerard's Cross. "Well," Izzy said when the car was finally facing the right way, "that was a tricky maneuver." When it came to the next week, Ursula was indeed absent from Izzy's column, even in fictional form. She had written instead about the freedom that the single woman could obtain from ownership of a little car. The joys of the open road far surpass being trapped on a filthy omnibus, or being followed down a dark street by a stranger. One has no need to glance nervously over one's shoulder at the wheel of a sunbeam. I say, that's grim, Pamela said. Do you think she has been followed down a street by a stranger? Lots of times, I expect. Ursula was not called upon again to be Izzy's special chum. Indeed, none of them heard from her again until she turned up on the doorstep on Christmas Eve, invited but not expected, and declared herself to be in a bit of a jam, a state which necessitated her being closeted in the growlery with Hugh, to emerge an hour later looking almost chastened. She had brought no presents with her and smoked throughout Christmas dinner, picking listlessly at her food. Annual income £20, Hugh said when Bridget brought the brandy-soaked pudding to the table. Annual expenditure £20.06, result misery. Oh, do shut up, Izzy said and flounced off before Teddy could put a match to the pudding. Dickens, Sylvie said to Ursula. J'étais un peu dérangée, Izzy said to Ursula, rather contritely, next morning by way of explanation. Silly of me, really, Izzy said. I got in a bit of a muddle. In the new year the Sunbeam disappeared and the Basil Street address was exchanged for a less salubrious one in Swiss Cottage, an even duller Android, but nonetheless Izzy remained undeniably Izzy. December 1923. Jimmy had a cold, so Pammy said she would stay at home with him and make decorations from silver milk bottle tops while Ursula and Teddy tramped along the lane in search of holly. Holly was abundant in the copse, but the copse was further away, and the weather was so wretched that they wanted to be outside for as little time as possible. Mrs. Glover, Bridget and Sylvie were confined to the kitchen, caught up in the afternoon drama of Christmas cooking. Don't pick any branches without berries, Pamela instructed as they left the house. And don't forget to look for some mistletoe as well. They went prepared with pruning shears and a pair of Sylvie's leather gardening gloves, having learned the painful lesson of previous Christmas foraging expeditions. They had their sights set on the big holly tree in the field at the far end of the lane, having been deprived of the handy holly hedge in the garden, which had been replaced by a more biddable privet after the war. The whole neighborhood was tamer and more suburban. Sylvie said it would not be long before the village had spread so much that they would be surrounded by houses. People must live somewhere, Hugh said reasonably. But not here, Sylvie said. It was unpleasantly windy and spitting with rain, and Ursula would have much preferred to stay by the fire in the morning room, with the festive promise of Mrs. Glover's mince pies scenting the whole house. Even Teddy, usually the one to find a silver lining, trudged disconsolately along beside her, hunched against the weather, a small, stalwart Knight Templar in his knitted grey balaclava. This is beastly, he said. Only Trixie relished the outing, ferreting in the hedgerows and delving in the ditch, as if she had been sent on a mission to unearth treasure. She was a noisy dog, much given to barking for reasons apparent only to herself, so when, way ahead of them in the lane, she began to yap deliriously they took little notice. Trixie had quietened down a bit by the time they caught up with her. She was standing sentinel over her prize, and Teddy said, "Something dead, I expect." Trixie was particularly skilled at truffling out half-rotted birds and the desiccated corpses of larger mammals. "A rat or a vole, probably," Teddy said. And then an eloquent "oh" when he saw the true nature of the trove in the ditch. "I'll stay here," Ursula said to Teddy, "and you run back to the house and fetch someone." But then as she watched his vulnerable little figure setting off, running alone along the deserted lane, the early winter dark already closing in around him, she had shouted at him to wait for her. Who knew what terror lay in wait? For Teddy, for all of them. There was confusion as to what to do with the body over the holiday, and eventually it was decided to keep it in the ice house at Ettringham Hall until after Christmas. Dr. Fellows, who had arrived along with a police constable, said the child had died of unnatural causes. A girl, 8 or 9 years old, her second set of front teeth had grown in although they had been knocked out before death. There were no little girls reported missing, the police said, certainly not locally. They speculated she might be a gypsy, although Ursula thought that gypsies took children, rather than left them behind. It was almost New Year before a reluctant Lady Daunt was willing to give her up. When they removed her from the ice house, they found her decorated like a relic, flowers and little tokens on her body, her skin bathed and her hair brushed and beribboned. As well as their 3 sons sacrificed to the Great War, the Daunts had also once had a girl, dead in infancy, and her custody of the little corpse had caused Lady Daunt to revisit her old grief, and she had gone out of her mind for a while. She wanted to bury the girl in the grounds of the hall, but there was a rebellious murmuring from the villagers who insisted that she be buried in the churchyard, not hidden away as Lady Daunt's pet, someone said. A strange kind of pet, Ursula thought. Neither her identity nor that of her murderer was ever discovered. The police questioned everyone in the neighborhood. They had come to Fox Corner one evening and Pamela and Ursula had almost hung themselves from the banisters in an attempt to hear what was said. From this eavesdropping they learned that no one in the village was a suspect, and that terrible things had been done to the child. In the end she was buried on the last day of the old year, but not before the vicar had christened her, as the general feeling was that although the girl was determined to remain an enigma, she should not be buried without a name. No one seemed to know how Angela was arrived at, but it seemed appropriate. Nearly the whole village turned out for the funeral, and many wept more heartily for Angela than they had ever done for their own flesh and blood. There was sadness rather than fear, and Pamela and Ursula often discussed why it was, exactly, that everyone they knew was regarded as innocent. Lady Daunt was not the only one to be strangely affected by the murder. Sylvie was particularly disturbed, more by anger, it seemed, than sadness. It's not, she fumed, that she was killed, although heaven knows that's terrible enough, it's that no one missed her. Teddy had nightmares for weeks afterwards, creeping into bed beside Ursula in the dead of night. They would forever be the ones who found her, the ones who had seen the little shoeless, sockless foot, bruised and grubby, poking out from the dead branches of an elm, her body shrouded with a cold coverlet of leaves. February 11, 1926. Sweet 16, Hugh said, kissing her affectionately. Happy birthday, little bear. Your future's all ahead of you. Ursula still harbored the feeling that some of her future was also behind her, but she had learned not to voice such things. They were to have gone up to London for afternoon tea at the Berkeley. It was half-term, but Pamela had recently twisted her ankle in a hockey match and Sylvie was recovering from an attack of pleurisy that had seen her spend a night in the cottage hospital. I suspect I have my mother's lungs, a remark that Teddy found funny every time he thought about it. And Jimmy was only just over a bout of the tonsillitis he was prone to. Going down like flies, Mrs. Glover said, beating butter into sugar for the cake. Who's next, I wonder? Who needs to go to a hotel for a decent tea anyway? Bridget said. Just as good here. Better, Mrs. Glover said. Although, of course, neither Bridget nor Mrs. Glover had been invited to the Berkeley, and indeed Bridget had never been inside a London hotel, or a hotel anywhere come to that, apart from having gone into the Shelbourne to admire the foyer before catching the ferry at Dunlow to come to England, a lifetime ago. Mrs. Glover, on the other hand, declared herself to be quite familiar with the Midland in Manchester, where one of her nephews, of which, it seemed, she had an endless supply, had taken her and her sister for dinner on more than one occasion. Coincidentally, Maurice was down for the weekend, although he had forgotten, if he ever knew, Pamela said, that it was Ursula's birthday. He was in his last year at Balliol, where he was reading law, and was more of a prig than ever according to Pamela. His parents didn't seem particularly taken with him either. He is mine, isn't he? Ursula had overheard Hugh say to Sylvie. You didn't have a dalliance in Deauville with that terrifically boring chap from Halifax, the one who owned the mill. What a memory you have, Sylvie laughed. Pamela had taken time out from her studies to make a lovely card, a decoupage of flowers cut out from Bridget's magazines, as well as baking a batch of her famous, in Fox Corner anyway, piccaninny biscuits. Pamela was studying for the entrance exam for Girton. A Girton girl, she said, her eyes alight, imagine. As Pamela prepared to leave the sixth form of the school they both attended, Ursula was about to enter it. She was good at classics. Sylvie said that she couldn't see the point of Latin and Greek, she had never been taught them and seemed to feel the lack. Ursula, on the other hand, was rather attracted to words that were now only whispers from the necropoles of ancient empires. If you mean dead, then say dead, Mrs. Glover said irritably. Millie Shawcross was also invited to tea, and had arrived early, her usual chirpy self. Her present was an assortment of lovely velvet hair ribbons, bought with her own money from the haberdashers in town. Now you'll never be able to cut your hair, Hugh said to Ursula, with some satisfaction. Maurice had brought 2 friends to stay for the weekend, Gilbert and an American, Howard, call me Howie, everyone does, who were going to have to double up in the spare room bed, a fact that seemed to make Sylvie uneasy. You can go top to tail, she told them briskly. Or one of you can sleep on a cot with the Great Western Railway, which was their name for Teddy's Hornby train set that took up all of Mrs. Glover's old room in the attic. Jimmy was allowed to share this pleasure. Your sidekick, huh? Howie said to Teddy, ruffling Jimmy's hair so vigorously that Jimmy was knocked off balance. The fact that Howie was an American gave him a special kind of glamour, although it was Gilbert who had the brooding, rather exotic, movie star looks. His name, Gilbert Armstrong, and his father, a high court judge, and his education, Stowe, pointed to impeccably English credentials, but his mother was the scion of an old Spanish aristocratic family, gypsies, Mrs. Glover concluded. Which was pretty much what she considered all foreigners to be. Oh my, Millie whispered to Ursula, the gods walk among us. She crossed her hands over her heart and flapped them like wings. Not Maurice, Ursula said. He would have been kicked off Olympus for getting on everyone's nerves. The Self-Importance of Gods, Millie said, what a wonderful title for a novel. Millie, needless to say, wanted to be a writer. Or an artist, or a singer, or a dancer, or an actress. Anything where she might be the center of attention. What are you little girls chattering about? Maurice said. Maurice was very sensitive, some might have said oversensitive, to criticism. You, Ursula said. Girls did find Maurice attractive, a fact that continually surprised the women in his own family. He had fair hair that looked as if it had been marcelled and a strapping physique from rowing, but it was hard to overlook his charmlessness. Gilbert, however, was even now kissing Sylvie's hand. Oh, said Millie, can it get any better? Maurice had introduced Sylvie as my old mater, and Gilbert said, you're too young to be anyone's mother. I know, Sylvie said. A rather louche fellow, was Hugh's verdict. A Lothario, Mrs. Glover said. The 3 young men seemed to fill Fox Corner, as if the house had suddenly shrunk, and both Hugh and Sylvie were relieved when Maurice suggested that they go outside for a tour of the grounds. Good idea, Sylvie said, work off some of that surplus energy. The 3 of them ran out into the garden in Olympian fashion, sportive rather than sacred, and commenced a hearty kickabout with a ball that Maurice had found in the hall cupboard. Mine, actually, Teddy pointed out to no one in particular. They'll ruin the lawn, Hugh said, observing them howling like hooligans as they chewed up the grass with their muddy brogues. Oh, Izzy said, when she arrived and caught sight of this athletic trio through the window, I say, they're rather gorgeous, aren't they? Can I have one? Izzy, swathed from head to toe in fox fur, said, I brought gifts, an unnecessary announcement, as she was laden with all kinds of different-shaped parcels in expensive wrapping for my favorite niece. Ursula glanced at Pamela and gave a rueful shrug. Pamela rolled her eyes. Ursula hadn't seen Izzy in months, not since a fleeting visit to Swiss Cottage in the car with Hugh to drop off a crate full of vegetables from Fox Corner's bountiful late summer garden. A marrow, Izzy said, inspecting the contents of the box. What on earth am I supposed to do with that? Prior to that she had visited for a long weekend, but had more or less ignored everyone except Teddy, whom she took off for long walks and quizzed relentlessly. I think she's singled him out from the herd, Ursula told Pamela. Why? Pamela said. So she can eat him. When questioned closely by Sylvie, Teddy was mystified as to why he had received special attention. She just asked me what I did, what school was like, what my hobbies were, what I liked to eat. My friends. Stuff like that. Maybe she wants to adopt him, Hugh said to Sylvie. Or sell him. I'm sure Ted would bring a good price. And Sylvie, fiercely, don't say things like that, not even in jest. But then Teddy was dropped by Izzy as swiftly as he'd been picked up by her, and they had thought no more of it. The first of Ursula's presents to be unwrapped was a recording by Bessie Smith, which Izzy immediately placed on the gramophone, home usually to Elgar and Hugh's favorite, the Mikado. The St. Louis Blues, Izzy said instructively. Listen to that cornet. Ursula loves this music. Do you? Hugh asked Ursula. I had no idea. Then a lovely tooled red leather edition of Dante in translation was produced. This was followed by a satin and lace bed jacket from Liberty's, as you know, a shop of which your mother is inordinately fond. This was pronounced far too grown-up by Sylvie. Ursula wears flannelette. Next a bottle of Shalimar, new by Guerlain, divine, which received a similar verdict from Sylvie. So speaks the child bride, Izzy said. I was 18, not 16, a tight-lipped Sylvie said. One day we must talk about what you got up to at 16, Isabel. What? Pamela said eagerly. I'll innovate pas d'importance, Izzy said dismissively. Finally, from this cornucopia, a bottle of champagne. And definitely far too young for that. Better get that on ice, Izzy said, handing it to Bridget. A perplexed Hugh glared at Izzy. Did you steal all this? He asked. Hey, darky music, Howie said when the three boys returned from the outdoors, crowding into the drawing room, and smelling vaguely of bonfires and something else, less definable, essence of stag, Izzy murmured, sniffing the air. Bessie Smith was now on her third go-round and Hugh said, it begins to grow on one after a while. Howie did some kind of odd dance to the music, vaguely barbaric, and then whispered something in Gilbert's ear. Gilbert laughed, rather crudely for someone with blue blood, albeit foreign, and Sylvie clapped her hands and said, boys, how about some potted shrimps, and marshaled them into the dining room when she noticed, too late, the dirty footprints they had tracked through the house. They didn't fight in the war, Hugh said, as if that explained their muddy sport. And that's a good thing, Sylvie said firmly. No matter how unsatisfactory they turn out. Now, Izzy said when the cake was cut and apportioned, I have one last gift, for goodness' sake, Izzy, Hugh interrupted, unable to contain his exasperation any longer. Who is paying for this? You have no money, your debts are piled to the rafters. You promised you would learn economy. Please, Sylvie said. Any discussion of money, even Izzy's, in front of strangers filled her with reticent horror. A sudden dark cloud passed over her heart. It was Tiffin, she knew. I am paying, Izzy said, very grandly. And this is not a present for Ursula, it is for Teddy. Me? Teddy said, startled on to center stage. He had been thinking what a jolly good cake it was and wondering what the chances of a second piece were and certainly had no desire to be pushed into the limelight. Yes, you, darling boy, Izzy said. Teddy visibly shrank away from both Izzy and the present that she put on the table in front of him. Go on, Izzy said encouragingly, unwrap it. It won't explode. But it would. Gingerly, Teddy removed the expensive paper. Unwrapped, the present turned out to be exactly what it looked like when wrapped, a book. Ursula, sitting opposite, tried to decipher the upside-down title. The Adventures of Augustus, Teddy read out loud by Delphi Fox. Delphi? Hugh queried. Why is everything an adventure with you? Sylvie said irritably to Izzy. Because life is an adventure, of course. I would say it was more of an endurance race, Sylvie said. Or an obstacle course. Oh, my dear, Hugh said, suddenly solicitous, not that bad, surely. Anyway, Izzy said, back to Teddy's present. The thick card of the cover was green, The lettering and line drawings were gold illustrations of a boy, roughly Teddy's age, wearing a schoolboy's cap. He was accompanied by a catapult and a small dog, a scruffy West Highland terrier. The boy was disheveled and had a wild look on his face. "That's Augustus," Izzy said to Teddy. "What do you think? I've based him on you." "Me?" Teddy said, horrified. "But I don't look like that. It's not even the right dog." "Something astonishing. Give anyone a lift back to town?" Izzy asked casually. "You haven't got another car?" Hugh moaned. "I parked it at the foot of the drive," Izzy said sweetly, "so as not to annoy you." They all trooped down the drive to inspect the car, Pamela, still on her crutches, hobbling tardily behind. "The poor and the maimed, the halt and the blind," she said to Millie, and Millie laughed and said, "For a scientist you know your Bible." "Best to know your enemy," Pamela said. It was cold and none of them had thought to put their coats on. "But really quite mild for this time of year," Sylvie said. "Not like when you were born. Goodness, I've never seen snow like that." "I know," Ursula said. The snow the day she was born was a legend in the family. She had heard the story so often that she thought she could remember it. "It's just an Austin," Izzy said. "An open road tourer, for doors though, but nowhere near as costly as a Bentley. Goodness, it's positively a vehicle for hoi polloi compared to your indulgence, Hugh." "On tick, no doubt," Hugh said. "Not at all, paid up in full, in cash. I have a publisher, I have money, Hugh. You don't need to worry about me anymore." While everyone was admiring, or not, in the case of Hugh and Sylvie, the cherry-bright vehicle, Millie said, "I have to go, I have a dancing exhibition tonight." "Thank you very much for a lovely tea, Mrs. Todd." "Come on, I'll walk you back," Ursula said. On the return home, through the well-worn shortcut at the bottom of the gardens, Ursula had an unexpected encounter. This was the something amazing, not the Austin tourer, when she almost tripped over Howie, on his hands and knees, rooting among the bushes. "Looking for the ball," he said apologetically. "It was your kid brother's. I think we lost it in the..." He sat back on his heels, and looked around helplessly at the berberis and buddleia shrubbery Ursula supplied. "We aspire to it." "Ha," he said, standing up in one clean move and suddenly towering above her. He looked as though he boxed. Indeed, there was a bruise below his eye. Fred Smith, who used to be the butcher's boy but now worked on the railways, was a boxer. Maurice had taken a couple of his pals to cheer Fred on in an amateur bout in the East End. Apparently it had dissolved into a boozy riot. Howie smelt of bay rum, Hugh's scent, and there was something polished and new about him, like a freshly minted coin. "Did you find it?" she asked. "The ball?" She sounded squeaky to her own ears. She had thought Gilbert was the handsome one out of the two, but faced with Howie's clean-limbed, uncomplicated strength, like a large animal, she felt stupid. "How old are you?" he asked. 16, she said. "It's my birthday." "You ate cake." Clearly she wasn't the only stupid one. "Hooey," he said, an ambiguous kind of word, closely related to his own name, she noted, although it seemed to signal amazement as if reaching 16 was a feat. "You're shivering," he said. "It's freezing out here." "I can warm you up," he said, and then, the something astonishing, he took her by the shoulders and pulled her towards him, and an action that necessitated bending down quite a bit, pushed his big lips against hers. Kiss seemed too courtly a word for what Howie was doing. He prodded his enormous tongue, like an ox's, against the portcullis of her teeth, and she was amazed to realize that he was expecting her to open her mouth and let the tongue in. She would choke, for sure. Mrs. Glover's tongue press in the kitchen came unwontedly to mind. Ursula was debating what to do. The bay rum and the lack of oxygen were making her dizzy, when they heard Maurice shouting, quite nearby, "Howie! Leaving without you, chum." Ursula's mouth was released and, without a word to her, Howie yelled, "Coming," so loudly that her ears hurt. Then he let go of her and set off, crashing through the bushes, leaving Ursula gasping for air. She wandered back to the house in a daze. Everyone was still on the drive, even though it felt like hours had passed, but she supposed it was only minutes really, like in the best fairy stories. In the dining room, the ruins of the cake were being licked delicately by Hattie. The Adventures of Augustus, lying on the table, had a smear of icing on it. Ursula's heart was still palpitating from the shock of Howie's advances. To be kissed on her 16th birthday, and in such an unlooked-for way, seemed a considerable accomplishment. She was surely passing beneath the triumphal arch that led to womanhood. If only it had been Benjamin Cole, then it would have been perfect. Teddy, the kid, himself appeared, very browned off, and said, "They lost my ball." "I know," Ursula said. He opened the book at the title page where, in a flamboyant hand, Izzy had inscribed, "To my nephew, Teddy. My own darling Augustus." "What rot," Teddy said, scowling. Ursula picked up a half-drunk glass of champagne, the rim of which was adorned with red lipstick, and poured half of it into a jelly glass that she handed to Teddy. "Cheers," she said. They chinked their glasses and drained them to the dregs. "Happy birthday," Teddy said.